More than half a century has passed. Hollywood has changed. The world has moved on. And yet, one image remains frozen in humanity's collective memory. A young man, sorrow in his eyes, standing alone, forever 24 years old. He is not remembered simply as an actor, not merely as a star, but as a symbol of lost youth, a restless soul, a dream left unfinished. Fame arrived fast, the spotlight burned bright, and the world began to say his name. Then, everything stopped, not with a proper ending, not with a final farewell. Just a moment of silence on an empty road. And the question has lingered ever since, suspended across decades. Why did someone who had only just reached the peak of a generation leave so suddenly? Before he became an icon, he was simply James Byron Dean, born in 1931 in a small town in Indiana, a place where life moved slowly and dreams rarely stretched beyond the edge of town. James's childhood took a sudden turn when he was only 9 years old. His mother died of cancer. A quiet departure, but one that left a void nothing could ever fill. From that moment on, James's world changed completely. The boy did not cry out. He did not rebel. He simply folded inward. James was sent to live with his grandparents in rural Indiana, a safe environment, but also a place where loneliness quietly grew with each passing year. Losing someone so early taught him to keep his emotions locked inside. He became more sensitive than most, easily wounded, yet remarkably skilled at hiding it. James did not seek attention. He sought recognition, not through words, but through glances, gestures, and long stretches of silence. That absence of affection left a subtle yet lasting mark, a fear of abandonment, and a hunger for love he never learned to speak aloud. When James began to think about the stage and acting, it was not simply a career dream. It was the only way he knew to be seen, to be heard, and to exist in the eyes of others. And from those early losses, the glow of the spotlight began to take shape, not as a reward, but as an escape. From the quiet losses of his childhood, James Dean did not enter cinema as a conqueror. He arrived as someone searching for a place to stand, and deeper still, searching for a reason to exist. The early years of his career carried no trace of glory. James lived in cramped, rented rooms. He took on whatever odd jobs he could just to survive. He auditioned endlessly. He was rejected far more often than he was accepted. He did not have the safe face Hollywood favored at the time, not polished, not balanced, not wrapped in the trained confidence designed to please audiences. James carried instability, and that alone made him incompatible with the old star system. There were periods when he was nearly invisible in New York City. A young actor, overflowing with emotion, yet no one quite knew where to place him. And then, the first light appeared. East of Eden, 1955, was not merely the film debut that launched James Dean to sudden fame and earned him an Academy Award nomination. It was a near-cruel alignment between real life and the screen. He played a son desperate for his father's love, trying everything to earn recognition, yet constantly feeling like an outsider. Few words, long silences, emotions that did not explode, but compressed, as if one more push might cause everything to break. Audiences did not just see a character. They saw something painfully real. And they sensed that James Dean was not acting. He was reliving himself. That performance forced Hollywood to stop. Not because of technique, but because of something unfamiliar, a human being who did not hide his fragility in front of the camera. Then came Rebel Without a Cause, also in 1955. Here, James Dean was no longer a solitary figure. He became the voice of an entire generation. A lost, rebellious young man, angry at the world, yet unable to name where that anger belonged. Not fighting anyone in particular, simply unable to fit into the molds already prepared for him. All it took was a red jacket, a closed-off posture, a restless, uncertain gaze. James Dean carved into history the image of unheard youth, young people overwhelmed by emotion, yet never taught how to name it. No one before him had brought confusion to the screen so nakedly. No one had turned vulnerability into a cinematic language. Then came the final role, Giant, 1956. A different James Dean emerged, more ambitious, sharper, a man who rises from the bottom of society to great heights. But the higher he climbs, the further he drifts from genuine connection. Power does not bring peace. Success does not heal loneliness. This role felt like a quiet prophecy. A person can achieve everything and still never find a place to stop. Just 3 films, no more. Yet each role touched something deeply real within James Dean. Emotional deprivation, the fear of abandonment, and the longing to be recognized as a whole human being. Hollywood began to realize they had not simply created a star, they were witnessing a form of presence that had never existed before. James Dean was unlike the stars who came before him. He was not glamorous, not controlled, not intent on hiding his cracks. He brought instability onto the screen. He carried silence into moments meant to climax. He placed loneliness at the very center of where brilliance was expected, and that is why an entire generation saw themselves in him. James Dean was called an icon, lifted onto the pedestal of legend. But behind that image was a very different human being. And it was precisely when James Dean was called an icon that he began to feel as though he belonged nowhere at all. Hollywood saw a phenomenon, a new face, an image capable of representing an entire generation. But James did not see that reflection in the mirror. He appeared on magazine covers, in newspapers, at premieres packed with people, surrounded by endless applause. Yet when the lights went out, when the room was left with only him inside it, that familiar feeling returned: emptiness. James Dean became famous too quickly, so quickly that he never had the chance to understand who he was becoming in the eyes of others. Hollywood began to shape him, wanted him to repeat the image that had succeeded, wanted him to be more stable, more predictable, less restless. But James did not know how to become that person. He did not blend into parties. He was uncomfortable with small talk. He did not know how to smile on cue. He was not made for wearing masks, present, yet always feeling as though he stood on the edge. James was loved by millions, yet he was never certain whether anyone truly understood him. He began to sense that he was being loved for an image, not for who he really was. Fame arrived early, too early, and it brought with it a pressure James had never been prepared to face. Every glance carried expectation. Every appearance had to mean something. Every moment of silence risked being interpreted. James was not allowed to be tired, not allowed to slow down, not allowed to lose direction. But inside, he had been exhausted for a very long time. There were nights when James drove alone along empty roads, not to escape, only to feel that he still controlled something. He was not searching for danger. He was searching for the sensation of being alive, of feeling uncontained, unobserved, unburdened by expectation. Hollywood is a world of light, but for James, it was also a place with too little darkness. And therefore, nowhere left to hide. He did not feel that he belonged to this world. Yet he did not know where he could return. James Dean's loneliness was not loud, not dramatized. It existed as a quiet undercurrent, seeping into every moment of success. Fame came early, but peace did not. And as the world looked at him as a symbol, James Dean began to feel himself slowly disappearing behind that very image. A man standing in brilliant light, yet inside unable to find a place to stop. In the early 1950s, when James Dean was still a young actor struggling to find his footing, love was not a luxury to him. It was a deeply human need, to be beside someone, to belong somewhere, even if only for a moment. At that stage, James was not yet an icon. There were no spotlights following his every step, no heavy expectations resting on his shoulders. Between 1951 and 1952, he entered what would become the most profound relationship of his life, with Pier Angeli. With Pier, James experienced something that came closest to the idea of family he had ever known. Gentle care, steady attention, and the feeling of being with someone without having to perform. It was a rare period when James seemed more at ease, less guarded, as if he truly believed he might be able to stay somewhere long enough without being abandoned. But as his career began to move forward in earnest, as his early roles drew him closer to Hollywood, everything started to change. By 1953-1954, their love was no longer just a matter between two people. Families became involved, studios, carefully calculated advice. James slowly realized that he was not a safe choice in a world that was beginning to measure everything in terms of image, reputation, and future prospects. The breakup with Pier Angeli happened quietly, not because the love had faded, but because there were doors that had never truly been opened to him. After that, James continued searching for that sense of closeness in other relationships. Between 1954 and 1955, he grew close to Liz Sheridan, a more discreet relationship with less spotlight and many long, intimate conversations deep into the night. Liz understood James not as an icon, but as a deeply conflicted human being. Yet even within that understanding, James could not remain for long. Whenever a relationship began to ask for stability, for clearer commitment, James would retreat, not through a spoken goodbye, but through gradual absence. During this same period, he had other brief relationships as well, including one with Ursula Andress. The attraction was intense. The emotions came quickly, but the depth was never enough to keep anyone there. Not because James did not know how to love, but because at that time, he was living at an unsustainable pace, his career accelerating by the day, while his emotions were always left behind. By 1955, as James Dean had become a name representing an entire generation, his emotional life grew even more fragile. Fame made him desired, but it also made him more doubtful than ever. Was someone approaching him for who he truly was, or for the image being constructed around him each day? And within that doubt, James kept his distance. Not completely closed off, but never open wide enough for anyone to stay for long. Looking back, love in James Dean's life did not collapse in a single tragic moment. It faded gradually, moving in parallel with his rising career, leaving behind not scandal, but increasingly visible absences. And as James stepped forward beneath the lights of 1955, one truth had become clear. He was never short of people who loved him. What he lacked was the time and the sense of safety to let one love remain. And then, after all the quiet fractures of love, James Dean entered 1955 like someone running alongside himself, On one side was a career erupting into life, East of Eden, rebel without a cause, and giant steadily building a legend. On the other side was the real man, who had barely had time to breathe. For James, speed was not just a passion, it was a way to keep silence from catching up with him. On the morning of September 30th, 1955, he prepared for what would later be called the final journey. He was heading toward a sports car race in Salinas, and the car he chose was not the one planned to be towed. Instead, he decided to drive his Porsche 550 Spider, the car he had nicknamed Little Bastard. With him was his mechanic, Rolf Wütherich. The support crew followed behind in another vehicle driven by Bill Hickman. The trip began like so many others. Small stops, long stretches of road, California sunlight, and the familiar feeling of still having control over one's life. At least for a few hours. But the most frightening thing about tragedy is that it often arrives when everything seems ordinary. That afternoon, near Cholame, California, at the intersection of State Route 46 and State Route 41, a junction that decades later would still be considered dangerous, James Dean's Porsche collided almost head-on with a Ford Tudor driven by Donald Turnipseed. There was no dramatic sequence here, no time to fully understand what was happening, just a single moment where everything was abruptly cut short. James Dean was critically injured and rushed to Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital. He did not survive. The man beside him, Rolf Wütherich, was injured but lived. Donald Turnipseed also survived, with lighter injuries. Just hours earlier, James had been driving toward the future. And then, that future vanished, as cleanly as a light being switched off. In the aftermath, the official investigation moved quickly. The coroner's inquiry concluded that it was an accident with no criminal intent involved. But for the public, that conclusion was never enough to close the sense of loss, because James Dean did not simply die at 24. He died at the precise moment the world had just begun to believe that it was witnessing something extraordinary, beginning. And from that moment, a paradox was born. James Dean left too soon, yet became an icon who would never grow old. And perhaps because everything ended so suddenly. For decades afterward, people have continued to ask, was it truly just an ordinary accident? Or was there something more that history has never fully spoken aloud? James Dean's death was officially ruled an accident. The case was closed quickly. Time moved on. But for the public, nothing ever truly ended. Some believe it was simply a traffic tragedy, a moment of misjudgment, a dangerous intersection, and a young man moving too fast along his own path. Others, however, feel that the story is not so simple. There are questions about speed. Was James Dean driving too fast, or had he already slowed down, as some witnesses later recalled? There are questions about the car itself. A Porsche that was light and powerful but notoriously difficult to control, especially at intersections without clear traffic signals. Others focus on the surviving witnesses, accounts that do not perfectly align, details that shift over time. Not because anyone was deliberately hiding the truth, but because human memory rarely remains fixed. Then there are the side stories, warnings before the trip, unnamed premonitions, details gradually embroidered over the years. Some believe James Dean knew what was coming. Others argue that we are simply projecting meaning onto an ending that arrived too abruptly. The truth is this: there is no evidence to suggest that it was anything other than an accident. And yet, there is no way to erase the feeling that everything stopped far too soon. These questions exist in parallel, not to replace the official truth, but to fill the emotional void left behind by James Dean's death. Because when someone leaves at the very moment of their brightest rise, the question is no longer only what happened. It becomes, we never fully understood who that person was. And from these unresolved questions, the story is forced to return to its most essential point. Not the car, not the intersection, but the state of James Dean before everything came to a halt. Because to understand why that ending remains so haunting, we must look again at James Dean not as an icon, but as a human being slowly running out of strength. Before everything came to a halt, James Dean was not a man in despair. He was still working, still making plans, still moving forward as if the future were waiting just ahead. But beneath that pace of life was a deep, lingering exhaustion that no one ever fully saw. Not the kind of fatigue born from physical labor, but the exhaustion of constant presence. Tired of every glance carrying expectation. Tired of every silence being open to misinterpretation. James Dean moved very fast in a very short span of time. Too fast to slow down. Too fast to recognize what he was truly feeling beneath layers of roles and public image. He did not collapse. He did not complain. He did not seek attention through pain. He simply grew exhausted. In a very quiet way. There were days when James completed his work with professionalism, but once he stepped off the set, he no longer had the energy to connect with the world around him. The pressure did not come from a single source. It came from the expectation that he must continue being the version the public had just fallen in love with, that he must preserve that intensity, that he must not change. But James did not stand still. Inside him, everything was still in motion. Unanswered questions, unfilled absences, and the feeling that he was living at a pace that allowed no room for deviation. At times, James turned to speed, not to challenge death, but to feel, unmistakably, that he was still alive. A moment of absolute focus, where the world narrowed just enough for the noise in his mind to briefly fall silent. He was not running toward death. He was only trying to outrun the emptiness. There were no clear warning signs, no final message left behind. Only a man carrying too many expectations on his shoulders before he had the chance to build an inner foundation strong enough to hold them. If we look back at James Dean at that moment, what appears is not tragedy, but something deeply human. Fatigue, sensitivity, and a quiet effort to keep his balance in a world that never slowed down. And it is precisely that state, not extreme, not desperate, just silently overloaded, that has made his departure so haunting in the memory of those left behind. As time creates enough distance, what remains after James Dean's death is not only regret, but areas that were never entirely clear. There are accounts that do not fully align, not because anyone was deliberately untruthful, but because each person stood in a different position within a moment that moved too fast to be fully captured. Some remember James slowing down. Others believe he was still driving fast. Some say the other car appeared suddenly. Others argue that the intersection had long been dangerous. These details do not contradict each other in opposition. They drift apart, like fragments that never quite fit into a single image. Even the official investigation, clear and reasonable in its conclusion, could not answer every emotional question the public carried with them. Because legal truth is not always the complete truth within the human mind. There are things that never make it into reports, mental states that cannot be measured, pressures that cannot be reduced to numbers, exhaustion that leaves no physical trace. James Dean died in a single, specific moment. But his story was shaped by multiple layers of time overlapping. A childhood marked by loss, a career accelerating too fast, love that never had time to take root, and a man who never truly stood still. Because of this, every attempt to isolate a single cause inevitably falls short. Not because the truth was hidden, but because the truth is never flat. Some deaths leave no grand secret behind, yet leave gaps deep enough to pull us back, to look once more and to ask, are we trying to solve an accident? Or are we trying to understand a human being who lived too fast in a world that would not allow him to slow down? And from these contradictions that cannot be untangled, the story begins to shift direction, no longer searching for what happened, but for what remains after everything else fades. Because no matter how his death is explained, James Dean leaves behind another question. A question of why, after so many decades, we still cannot look away from him. James Dean left the world at just 24 years old, not long enough to grow old, not long enough to repeat himself, and perhaps not long enough for the world to exhaust him in the usual way. His death closed a very short life, yet opened a presence that would stretch across decades. James Dean did not leave behind a vast body of work, just 3 films, 3 roles, 3 very different fragments of the same human being. But it is precisely that brevity that has kept his image from ever wearing thin. He never lived long enough to become a star, repeating himself. Never long enough to be boxed in. Never long enough to be replaced. James Dean remains in the public memory as something unfinished, something that had only just begun before it suddenly stopped. For later generations, he is not merely an actor of the 1950s. He is a symbol of youth that could not find its place, of people who carry too much emotion without ever being taught how to speak it aloud. The fragility James brought to the screen became a shared language for anyone who has ever felt lost in a world too fast, too loud. Some icons are shaped by achievement. James Dean was shaped by absence. The absence of time, the absence of stability, the absence of a complete ending. And perhaps that is why he has never been pushed into the past. James Dean does not live on through film because he was perfect. He lives on because he was profoundly human. When the lights have long gone dark, when the debates slowly fade, what remains is not the question of the car or the intersection that day. What remains is a silence. The silence of a life never given the chance to be complete. The silence of a generation that still sees itself reflected in those eyes. And perhaps, within that silence, James Dean remains, saying nothing more, quietly allowing the world to keep asking about the cost of youth and the cost of living too fast. James Dean's story does not end with an answer. It comes to rest in a pause, a space where each of us carries our own response. You may see in him a symbol of rebellious youth, or perhaps simply a man who moved too fast in a world that never allowed anyone to slow down. If this story made you pause for a moment, if you saw a part of yourself somewhere in that gaze, leave your thoughts below. And if you're drawn to stories like this, subscribe to the channel and continue walking with us through the journeys ahead. Thank you for watching, and see you again in the next video.